Everyone thought she was just a child lost in daydreams, a little girl pretending to be bigger than she was. But in the next few minutes, she would silence an entire room of hardened military men and prove them all wrong. The colonel laughed first, his sharp voice echoing like a whip in the air of Fort Braxton's officers' club. "You? Shoot on my range?" His booming laughter made the glassware rattle, sending shivers down the polished tables. The other men followed his lead, roaring with amusement, some even wiping tears from their eyes. To them, this was entertainment. To the girl standing in front of them, this was everything. Her name was Maya Johnson, just 12 years old, wearing a faded dress, holding an old envelope in trembling hands. Around her neck rested a medal so large against her small chest it seemed almost absurd, her father's Medal of Honor. Sergeant David Johnson had died 3 years earlier in combat. To Maya, this medal was more than medal and ribbon. It was a promise. And today, she intended to keep it. "Sir," Maya began, her voice trembling but clear, "I request permission to use the firing range today." The room erupted again, laughter rolling like thunder. Colonel Marcus Steele leaned forward in his grand leather chair, his sharp blue eyes glittering with cruelty. "Permission? To shoot? Little girl, what are you trying to honor here? Your father or your imagination?" He smirked, glancing at his officers, inviting their ridicule. Maya's cheeks burned, but she didn't step back. "It's the 3rd anniversary of my father's death," she said, gripping the envelope tightly. "He taught me to shoot. I want to honor him by practicing, the way he showed me." Steele slammed his hand against the desk, rattling the whiskey glasses. "Did you hear that? She thinks she can shoot," he barked with laughter. "What's next? She'll want to fly one of our fighter jets?" The officers howled again. Major Thompson shook his head with mock pity. "Children should play with dolls, not with firearms," Captain Williams chimed in, smirking. "A school desk suits little girls better than a rifle." The cruel words stabbed, but Maya stood straighter, her father's medal glinting under the overhead light. These men didn't know the truth. They didn't know about the countless afternoons spent training beside her father, the long weekends at the range, the patience and discipline he instilled in her. For 6 years, David Johnson, the best marksman on the base, had shaped his daughter into something no one here would ever expect. But Sergeant Johnson's lessons weren't only about marksmanship. They were about dignity, resilience, and the quiet strength to rise when mocked. And Maya had carried those lessons like sacred scripture since the day he fell in combat. Colonel Steele rose from his seat, his towering figure casting a shadow over the small girl. He walked around his desk slowly, deliberately, like a predator circling prey. "This base is no place for childish fantasies. Guns aren't toys. Our range is not for little girls to play pretend. Go home, watch cartoons, and leave the real work to men." The room roared again, but this time a few uneasy glances flickered among the officers. Maya's calm eyes hadn't wavered. She breathed deeply, steadying herself the way her father had taught her. "With respect, sir," she said, her voice calm and deliberate. "I have all the required papers, approved supervision from the military family office, safety procedures followed. My request is valid." Major Peterson nearly choked on his drink. "Well, look at that. She even knows the paperwork." More laughter erupted, though quieter this time, more uncertain. Colonel Steele's smirk faltered for the briefest moment. There was something unsettling in the way Maya held his gaze. Her eyes carried a weight he recognized, the look of soldiers who had faced fear and returned stronger. "Stubborn, aren't you?" he said at last, his tone dripping with condescension. Then his cruel smile returned. "Fine. You want to embarrass yourself in front of everyone? Let's make this interesting." He turned to the officers. "Gentlemen, let's give this child her chance. 10 shots at 50 meters. If she hits even 3 targets, I'll sign her paper. But when she fails, and she will, She will never waste our time again." The room cheered in approval, convinced they were about to witness a comedy. But Maya only nodded once, calm, certain. A spark lit in her chest, but she didn't let it show. "I accept, sir," she replied, her voice steady. And at that moment, as the officers jeered and laughed, none of them realized the truth. They weren't preparing to watch a failure. They were about to witness a legend. The heavy oak doors of the officers' club swung open, and the group spilled into the long hallway of Fort Braxton. Their laughter echoed against the tall walls, bouncing back like cruel reminders. Maya walked a few steps behind them, small but unshaken. Every word of mockery trailed after her like a shadow, but she did not flinch. She had heard worse from teachers, classmates, and strangers. This was nothing compared to the silence of standing at her father's grave, whispering a promise only she could keep. "I bet she'll faint the moment she pulls the trigger," Captain Williams muttered loudly enough for others to hear. "Or cry for her mother," added Major Thompson, rubbing his hands in delight. The men laughed again, their polished shoes clapping on the floor like a marching band of arrogance. But Maya had been here before. Not in this hallway, but in this feeling. Doubt pressing in on her like a storm, voices mocking, daring her to fold. And every time her father's voice whispered back in her mind, "Breathe, princess, calm in the storm. That's where strength lives." As they neared the firing range, Colonel Steele slowed his steps, making sure the girl stayed within view. His smile was cruel, his stride filled with the confidence of a man convinced of victory. "Pick your weapon, little girl," he said, gesturing toward a table of standard-issue firearms lined up neatly. "Choose your tool for failure. If I were you, I'd pick the smallest one. Maybe then you can at least hold it without falling over." The officers roared again. But Maya walked forward, calm as a still lake. She didn't rush. She let her hand hover over each weapon, feeling their weight in her memory. At last, she touched the Glock 19 pistol, the same model her father had used when he first taught her, back when she was only 7 years old. Her small hand gripped the pistol with quiet familiarity. "This one," she said softly. "Interesting choice," Steele sneered, pretending interest. "At least you'll fail with style." A ripple of laughter rolled through the group, but Sergeant Rodriguez, the range instructor, did not laugh. His dark eyes narrowed, watching the way Maya handled the weapon. The way she checked the chamber, ejected the magazine, inspected the sights, and tested the trigger. Smooth, practiced. Too smooth for a child who supposedly had no place there. Rodriguez had worked with David Johnson. He had seen the man's skill. And now, watching Maya, a cold thought slipped into his mind. Could it be she's just like him? "Colonel," Rodriguez began cautiously, "maybe we should add extra supervision." "Nonsense," Steele snapped, cutting him off. "She wants to play soldier. She'll learn like one. No help. No special treatment." His tone was so sharp that even some of his own men looked away. Maya ignored them all. She took her stance in front of the range, her motions deliberate and precise. She loaded the magazine, slid the chamber, and set her feet. Her breathing steadied. For a brief moment, when her eyes closed, it was as if the room, the laughter, the cruelty, all of it vanished. In the silence of her mind, her father's voice returned. "Feel the air. Listen between your heartbeats. That's where the perfect shot lives." When she opened her eyes, the trembling child was gone. Standing in her place was someone calm, unshaken, and quietly powerful. "Ready when you are," she said, her voice steady enough to quiet even some of the mockers. Colonel Steele crossed his arms, glaring down at her. 10 shots, 50 meters, you need 3 hits, you have 60 seconds, begin." A hush fell over the crowd. The laughter quieted into whispers, then into silence. For the first time, the officers were not sure if this would end in comedy or something entirely different. And as Maya raised the pistol, her hands steady, her eyes sharp, The atmosphere shifted. The challenge was no longer just a test. It had become a moment of reckoning. The air inside the range grew thick with silence. Even the men who had been laughing a moment ago now found themselves leaning forward, curious in spite of their arrogance. The targets stood 50 meters away, black circles against pale boards, waiting like witnesses to history. Maya adjusted her stance. Her feet parted shoulder-width, her knees bent slightly, her shoulders relaxed. To an untrained eye, it looked ordinary. To Sergeant Rodriguez, it was chillingly familiar. That's David's stance, he thought, a shiver running down his spine. That's exactly how her father used to stand before firing. Colonel Steele smirked, pretending boredom. Well, don't take all day. The clock is ticking. Maya didn't look at him. She inhaled slowly, exhaled. Her heartbeat slowed. The pistol felt like an extension of her hand, her father's lessons flowing back as if he stood behind her once again. Breathe. Focus. Feel the rhythm of silence. The first shot cracked through the air. The officers chuckled, already preparing to celebrate her miss. But Sergeant Rodriguez lifted the binoculars, froze, and said nothing. The bullet had struck dead center. The second shot rang, then the third. Each one echoed like thunder in the dead quiet. The laughter began to fade. By the fourth shot, no one was smiling. By the fifth, the silence in the range felt heavier than steel. Colonel Steele's smirk faltered. He shifted his arms, his confidence draining. She just got lucky, he muttered under his breath. But no one answered him. Maya didn't hurry. She didn't pause to gloat. Each shot flowed naturally, one after the other, smooth and precise, her breathing in perfect rhythm. Seventh shot, eighth, ninth. By then, every officer's face had grown pale. The whispers stopped entirely. Then came the 10th shot. Maya paused for the briefest moment, tilting her head as a faint gust of wind slipped across the range. Her eyes narrowed. Calmly, without a flicker of doubt, she adjusted her aim a fraction to the left. It was the kind of minute correction only seasoned snipers ever noticed. The pistol cracked. The bullet tore through the air and struck its mark with impossible precision. The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights, the shifting of boots against the concrete floor. Dozens of men, officers with years of service, stood frozen, staring at the little girl who had just done the impossible. Maya lowered her weapon, clicked the safety on, and stood tall. 10 shots complete, sir, she said formally, turning to face Colonel Steele. For the first time since the challenge began, Steele's face betrayed uncertainty. His eyes darted to Rodriguez, who was still staring through the binoculars as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Well, Steele barked, though his voice cracked slightly. How many? 4? 5? Rodriguez lowered the binoculars, his hands trembling. His expression had shifted from curiosity to disbelief, then finally to something like reverence. He looked at Maya, then back at Steele. All 10, sir, he said slowly. Dead center, not just hits. Grouped so perfectly it looks like a single hole. Gasps erupted from the watching officers. Major Thompson's jaw dropped. Captain Williams swore under his breath. One by one, men who had laughed at Maya's request just minutes earlier stared in stunned silence, their arrogance collapsing. Impossible, Steele whispered, snatching the binoculars from Rodriguez. He pressed them to his eyes, desperate to prove it was some trick, some mistake. But the sight crushed him. 10 bullets had fused into what looked like one enlarged mark, a feat so rare that even elite shooters often failed to achieve it. His fingers shook as he lowered the binoculars. The cruel confidence that had carried him through every insult, every laugh, every order, now dissolved in the face of something undeniable. A 12-year-old girl had just broken every expectation, every prejudice, every arrogant word he had spoken. Maya stood quietly, Not triumphant, not boastful, just calm, dignified, as if she had simply done what she promised her father she would do. And in that silence, as every officer tried to process the impossible, one truth became clear. The lesson had only just begun. Colonel Steele lowered the binoculars with trembling hands. His face, once smug and commanding, now looked pale under the fluorescent lights of the range. The silence pressed down on him like a heavy weight, broken only by the distant flutter of the flag outside. For the first time in his long career, Steele realized he had lost control of the room. Major Thompson stepped forward, his voice unsteady. "My God, that grouping is better than anything I've seen in 20 years of service." He wasn't joking now. He wasn't mocking. His words carried something Steele could not tolerate. Respect. Respect for a child he had tried to humiliate. Captain Williams swallowed hard, staring at the target through narrowed eyes. The sneer that had lived on his lips all afternoon was gone. He muttered softly, "That's not shooting. That's artistry." The officers began to murmur, their once proud voices now uneasy, drifting like whispers of betrayal against Steele's authority. Every face turned toward Maya. She hadn't celebrated, hadn't smiled, hadn't raised her voice. She simply stood tall, pistol lowered, her father's medal glinting against her chest. Sergeant Rodriguez broke the silence. He walked over, his boots echoing across the concrete floor. His face was solemn, but his eyes carried a quiet fire. He stood beside Maya, shoulders squared proudly, and addressed the room in a voice everyone could hear. "Miss Johnson," he said firmly, "your father would be the proudest man alive right now. You didn't just honor him today. You honored this entire base. What you've done, it sets a new standard for excellence." The words struck like a thunderclap. The officers shifted uncomfortably, shame creeping into their eyes. To mock her now would mean mocking a soldier's legacy, and no man among them dared. Colonel Steele's jaw tightened. His pride fought desperately against the truth. This must be equipment failure. Faulty sights, trick shooting." His excuses sounded weak even to himself. No one believed him. Maya's eyes met his, calm, unblinking. "Respect is earned by action, sir," she said quietly, "not by words." The statement landed heavier than a bullet. Men who had seen war, who had faced enemy fire, now felt a 12-year-old girl cutting through their pride with nothing but the truth. Rodriguez stepped closer, lowering his voice but making sure everyone still heard. "Colonel, you can't deny what we all saw. She just outshot every man here. And that's not luck. That's mastery." The murmurs grew. Some officers looked at Steele with doubt for the first time. Others avoided his gaze altogether. He felt it, authority slipping through his fingers, his control crumbling like sand. Rodriguez turned back to Maya. "Would you like to try longer distances?" he asked gently, almost like a mentor inviting a student forward. Maya's eyes flickered with curiosity. "What distances do you have in mind, Sergeant?" 100 meters. 200. Even farther if you're willing," Rodriguez replied. His voice carried respect, not ridicule. The colonel's stomach twisted. His humiliation was already unbearable, but the thought of this girl proving herself again at greater ranges threatened to ruin him completely. "This circus has gone far enough," he snapped. "She proved her point. Now let's—" But the officers weren't listening. Their attention was locked on Maya, drawn to the calm certainty in her small frame. They wanted to see more. They wanted to witness what else this child, this soldier's daughter, could do. Maya looked down at her pistol, then back at Rodriguez. Her voice was soft, but firm. 200 meters, she said. The range fell silent again. Even Steele, for all his fury, felt his throat go dry. Because deep inside, he knew the truth. The girl hadn't reached her limit. She was only beginning. The new targets were set further down range. The distance doubled to 200 meters. To most, It was a distance that separated amateurs from trained marksmen. Even seasoned soldiers often struggled here. For a 12-year-old girl, it should have been impossible. But Maya Johnson wasn't ordinary. She stepped forward with the same calm poise, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. She checked her Glock, reloaded, and steadied herself. The officers whispered nervously, some folding their arms, others craning forward. The earlier laughter was gone. What filled the air now was anticipation, sharp and electric. Colonel Steele paced behind them, sweat beginning to show on his temples. He barked out, 200 meters! If she misses even one, it proves the first round was a fluke. His voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed desperation. Rodriguez ignored him. He stood near Maya, giving no guidance, only watching as if witnessing history. "Take your time," he said softly. Maya inhaled. The noise, the pressure, the stares, they all fell away. In her mind, she heard only her father's voice. Breathe steady. Feel the rhythm. Trust the shot. The first bullet cracked. Rodriguez lifted his binoculars. His lips parted, but no sound came. The round had struck the very center. Dead perfect. The second shot landed beside the first, then the third, the fourth, the fifth. By the time Maya fired her sixth, Rodriguez lowered the binoculars slowly, staring at her as though looking at something beyond human. Captain Williams finally muttered, That's sniper-level grouping." His face was pale. The eighth shot rang, followed by the ninth, each finding the mark with precision. When the 10th and final round struck, Rodriguez whispered hoarsely, "All center mass. All of them." The officers broke into hushed gasps, some shaking their heads, others gripping the rail as if steadying themselves. They were soldiers, professionals, men who had prided themselves on skill. And yet, here was a child, shattering everything they thought possible. Maya lowered her pistol and turned back calmly. Her eyes didn't shine with arrogance, only with quiet certainty. 200 complete, she said. Steele's throat worked, but no words came out. His authority crumbled further with every second of silence. He could feel his men slipping away from him, their loyalty shifting toward the girl who had just outclassed them all. Rodriguez took a step closer, his voice steady but louder now, for all to hear. "Colonel, this isn't luck. This isn't chance. This is mastery, and mastery deserves respect." The words cut deep. Officers who once laughed now nodded silently. Some even looked at Maya with admiration, their faces filled with something close to shame. But Maya wasn't finished. She looked back toward the range. "Do you have 300 meters available?" she asked softly. Gasps broke out, the audacity of it. A child asking to attempt what even decorated shooters often feared. Rodriguez didn't hesitate. "Yes, we can set it." Steele snapped, "Enough! This has gone far enough!" His voice cracked like a whip, but it carried no weight anymore. The room no longer moved to his command. Men ignored him, their eyes fixed on Maya. Within minutes, new targets were set at 300 meters. Maya adjusted her stance, her small figure dwarfed by the length of the range. She raised the Glock, calm as ever. 300 meters, she whispered. For him. The shots rang again, each one precise, controlled, impossibly accurate. With every round that struck the mark, whispers turned into stunned silence, silence into reverence. By the final shot, battle-hardened veterans rubbed their eyes, some even shaking their heads in disbelief. Rodriguez lowered his binoculars with trembling hands. His voice was hoarse, but clear. "She's hitting coin-sized groups, at 300, with iron sights. Gentlemen, do you understand what that means?" They did. And that was why no one dared laugh anymore. Maya Johnson wasn't simply proving herself. She was rewriting the limits of what they thought was possible. And the men who once mocked her were now witnesses to their own undoing. The sun outside dipped low, casting long shadows across the range. The air felt charged, as though the very ground knew something historic was unfolding. Soldiers, officers, and onlookers who had gathered in whispers now stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes locked on the girl who had transformed their jeers into reverence. 500 meters, Maya said at last, her calm voice carrying through the silence. The crowd stirred. 500 meters was the realm of trained snipers, a test that even elite marksmen respected with caution. With iron sights, it bordered on impossible. Colonel Steele's eyes widened, his hands clenched into fists. "This is madness," he barked, though his words sounded hollow. He tried again, louder this time, desperate. "No one here expects her to—" Rodriguez cut him off, his voice calm, almost commanding. "She's not here to meet expectations, Colonel. She's here to break them." The targets were set far across the field, tiny dots against the fading light. Maya raised her pistol once more, her small hands steady, her breathing slowed, her stance perfect. Inside her heart, her father's voice spoke again. "At distance, Princess. It's not about the weapon. It's about the will. Trust your eye. Trust the silence between heartbeats." The first shot rang. Rodriguez lifted the binoculars and froze. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The crowd read his silence. The bullet had struck dead true. One after another, Maya fired. Each crack of the pistol echoed like history being written. The second, the third, the fourth, all found their mark. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd. By the seventh, hardened veterans, men who had survived battles overseas, stood with their mouths open, unable to process what they were seeing. On the ninth shot, a hush fell so deep you could hear the faint rustle of leaves outside. Maya adjusted slightly, tilting her wrist to correct for a breeze so subtle no one else had even noticed. The pistol cracked. The bullet struck dead center. Then came the 10th. She inhaled, exhaled, squeezed the trigger. The sound of the round echoed like thunder rolling across the base. The bullet struck home with impossible precision, the grouping so tight it was nearly invisible. Rodriguez lowered the binoculars slowly. His voice shook as he spoke. "At 500 meters, coin-sized grouping, with iron sights." He turned toward Steele. "Colonel, you're looking at the greatest marksman this base has ever seen." Gasps, then murmurs, then something louder. A ripple of awe spreading through the men. For the first time, applause broke out. Slow at first, hesitant, then stronger, louder, until it filled the entire range. Officers who had mocked her were clapping with trembling hands. Soldiers cheered openly. Some wiped at their eyes, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Maya lowered her pistol, calm and composed. She turned, facing the colonel. "Respect is earned by action, sir," she repeated. Her father's words carried through her. Colonel Steele looked around, saw his authority shattered. The officers no longer looked at him with loyalty. They looked at her. He felt the weight of his humiliation crushing him, heavier than any battlefield defeat. Within weeks, complaints would pile against him. Investigations would uncover his years of arrogance and prejudice. His career, once shining, would collapse into disgrace. But for Maya Johnson, this was only the beginning. 6 months later, she walked the halls of Fort Braxton with a gold badge pinned to her chest, Junior Precision Marksmanship Instructor, Army Exceptional Talent Program. At 13, she became the youngest person in U.S. military history to hold that honor. Videos of her impossible performance spread online. Little girl humiliates colonel with perfect shooting. 47 million views in 2 weeks. She became a symbol, not just for soldiers, but for children across the country. Letters poured in from kids who saw her as proof that dreams could overcome prejudice. The firing range was renamed the David Johnson Range, with a bronze plaque honoring both father and daughter. Every recruit who trained there learned her story. Every officer who sneered at her memory was forced to remember the day arrogance was silenced by truth. Rodriguez, now her mentor, told her one quiet afternoon, "Your father would be proud, Maya, but he'd be even prouder of the woman you're becoming." And every Saturday, Maya still visited her father's grave. She no longer cried. She simply placed her hand on the stone, smiled softly, and whispered, "I did it, Dad. I showed them what we're capable of." Her story became legend, a permanent reminder that prejudice can break, but talent endures. That respect isn't given, it's earned, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the loudest truths. The little girl who once stood trembling before a colonel had grown into a force no one could ignore. And if this story of courage and justice moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because here, we bring you more stories of people who turned humiliation into history, weakness into strength, and doubt into the greatest victories of their lives.